Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to ask the musical question, whatever happened to Alfred Brendel? And the reason I'm asking this question is because, we're doing a series of videos on reference recordings, and we're going to cover a lot of piano repertoire. And we've already talked about quite a bit of repertoire in which Brendel was supposedly the supreme exponent of the closing decades of the 20th century. That is Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, things like that, And in the comments, we talk about which performances are the reference, and then you all chime in with which ones you like best and all that stuff. And somehow Brendel doesn't get mentioned, which I think is fascinating. I mean, consider the fact that the guy recorded 4 complete Beethoven piano concerto cycles. 4! Count them! And he was relentlessly flogged by one of the major classical labels, that is Philips, now Decca, and had the advantage of that kind of sustained publicity for decades. I mean, decades. Even his early stuff, here it is. I didn't feel like bringing the big box. He got a big box. He got a big box from Decca, a huge box. I have it sitting over there in the huge box area. I don't feel like heavy lifting. It's too early in the morning. But, we've got this brilliant classics collection of all of his Vox and Vanguard early recordings, which are often as good, if not better, than his remakes. And yet, he doesn't seem to get any mention. And there were signs of that, sort of while he was still around. There was a kind of desperation to his, consistent remaking of the same repertoire. I don't know why he kept doing that. Partly there was the analog digital thing, and then there was the general insanity of, the labels wanting to record everything, no matter who did it or how much. But he reminded me a little bit of, Herbert von Karajan and people like that who kept doing Beethoven cycles. He was shooting himself in the foot as far as, achieving reference status for anything. Because when you do a Beethoven concerto cycle every few years, you're really is effectively dismissing your earlier work. And if you're not, you're just an arrogant fool. I mean, you say, well, everything I did is so fabulous. How could you choose between my 50 versions of the same thing? I mean, really. I mean, people aren't that stupid. But when you think that, also consider the fact that his last Beethoven concerto cycle, the ultimate, was put together so as to allow Philips to promote the big names. It was the Vienna Philharmonic, Alfred Brendel, and Simon Rattle, who was, of course, the flavor of the month. And that came out at a time when, let's just face it, I mean, gramophone, the English musical press, those were the voices of classical music respectability for quite a while. There was no real competition for them. In other countries, there were other audio magazines that may have been, more popularly read in those countries. But for publicity purposes, you could always count on trotting out Simon Rattle and getting someone raving no matter what else was going on with anybody else. And so there was that Beethoven piano concerto cycle. The prior one was the live one with James Levine, whatever you want to call him. I don't even remember now that he's gone. James Levine and the Chicago Symphony. And then the first one was with Bernard Haitink. And these were all, you would think, major productions just in the Beethoven concertos. Then, of course, there were his sonata cycles and all of his Mozart. Originally, he was included in the big Mozart edition with Neville Mariner and, that kind of stuff. And then he did a lot of remakes, some of which were beautiful. And I want to make something very clear. I'm not passing any judgment on his quality as a pianist, on what his ultimate status ought to be. I'm just talking about the way he's been promoted and marketed, and then the sort of public perception. We've done many videos about Beethoven sonata cycles, about Mozart piano concertos, things like that. His meat and potatoes repertoire. We've talked about Liszt, we've talked about Haydn, and his name just doesn't come up. I'm talking about what you're telling me. my reaction to what you've been saying and what you've been posting in the comments. And it really, really has struck me as remarkable, because while he was alive, he was absolutely, while he was alive, I'm sorry, he's still alive. I'm sorry, Alfred. He's 93. The last time I met him was at the MEDEM, convention where we do the Con Classical Awards, and he got a Lifetime Achievement Award. I think he did anyway. And he was there not to play the piano. He was there to read poetry, because he writes very quirky, humorous poetry. And he was also, he retired in 2008 from playing the piano, which was smart. I mean, he retired when it was time for him to retire, because he'd done everything 100 times and didn't want to do more. It's really, really strange. I have not figured it out. And I think that the sad thing is, the crazy thing about the wonderful world of classical music is that when he passes away, and God forbid, he's, like I said, he's 93 and still, we think relatively healthy, hopefully, and has a fulfilling, career in retirement as a lecturer and person, and, eminence grise in many areas. But, probably when he passes away, that's when people will pay attention to him again, because that will be an opportunity for people to talk about him and evaluate his legacy. Until then, it's as though he never existed. And I'm just throwing this out there. I mean, I'm not trying to make a big thing about it. I just am really, really curious. I did see him play the piano a couple of times. The last time he was in very good form. He played the Emperor Concerto with the Baltimore Symphony when I was in college. So that was around in the early 80s. So I did see him do that. And it was okay. I mean, he played it well enough. One of the things about Brendel that always sort of turned some people off was the fact that his tone was notably unalluring. He had a very flinty, somewhat dry tone. And then interpretively, too, he could be quirky. He could be weirdly quirky. I mean, he was in some of his Liszt recordings. His Haydn sonatas are very strange. He did some things like that where, people either liked it or didn't like it. But there wasn't much that was alluring about the man for some reason. And what makes things doubly curious, one of you asked me in the comments why we haven't talked about reference recordings and things yet with Claudio Arrau. Well, one of the reasons is because Claudio Arrau was another Phillips pianist. And he was a Phillips pianist at the same time that Brendel was. And Phillips decided they were promoting Brendel and not Claudio Arrau. And so Arrau's work, although a lot of it was very different, he was a wonderful Chopin, Debussy, things that Brendel tended to stay away from. But he also did all the standard German stuff. He did Brahms, he did Beethoven, he did Schubert, and Mozart. So it was really to Arrau's disadvantage that Brendel was on the scene at the same time. But now people still talk about Claudio Arrau, of course, and they don't talk about Brendel. I mean, Arrau has a following. He always had a following. I mean, almost a cult following, but he has a following. And it seems that Brendel never did. Brendel was very much the creation of the classical music marketplace, the promotional end of the major labels, and not so much the spontaneous enthusiasm of musical listeners, of the public at large. Is that right? Am I saying that right? I mean, does that resonate with any of you? I just don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I just wanted to make a point here because I've been very surprised. Very, very surprised at the reaction. I'm curious to know what you all think about that. I really would be. Those of you, of course, who know Alfred Brendel's work. If you don't know Alfred Brendel's work, you don't have to comment. Please don't feel obligated. But if you do, and I know there are lots of piano mavens and people out there who are quite familiar with what he did, why is it we're not talking about him at all when we go through all of these cycles of things in which he was such a presence only a few decades ago? It's a puzzlement, as they say in The King and I. So keep on listening, friends. I'm very curious to have your input on this question. Take care.